Wow, what a passage. I don't know if you've got a Bible with you, but if you do, have it open, because this is awesome. I wonder if some of you saw in the news the James Webb Space Telescope that had recently been built by NASA. And there was some, anyone see that? Yeah, and there were some photos that came back from this telescope. It's just an amazing thing, isn't it? Because this telescope enables us to see further into the sort of, or not the farthest, but so far out into the furthest reaches of the universe, if you like. It's just this incredible thing, and you will have seen these pictures come back, and these amazing pictures of galaxies and stars. And somebody, I think, I read somewhere that something like the images that you're seeing from this telescope are something like 4.6 billion years old, or something like crazy like that, because it's taken so long for the light to reach us. I don't exactly understand all of that. Someone might be able to explain it afterwards, but it's just the most incredible, just awe-inspiring thing to see through this telescope. And I was thinking about that, because this telescope enables us to see things that we've never seen before. And, as we come and look at this passage in Colossians, it's like Paul is turning his telescope, his focus, and it's not focused on creation, as awe-inspiring as creation is, but Paul focuses his gaze on the Creator. Paul's gaze is fixed on the Creator. And I guess my hope for us today is when we look at these incredible words from Colossians. I think these words from Colossians are some of the most important words in the whole of the New Testament about the person of Jesus. I guess it's my prayer that today we might see something new, that we might just be captured again with a vision of Jesus, and that as we do that, that our hearts might just be set on fire again with love for him. Paul is writing to the church in Colossae, and he's wanting to underline for them the supremacy and the sufficiency of Jesus Christ. That's what he's wanting to do. He's wanting to underline for them the supremacy and the sufficiency of Jesus Christ. There were two challenges, there were two pressures that were the church in Colossae were facing. It was a new church, they were young in the faith. There was two very real challenges that they were facing. The first challenge was that they were challenged to reduce the status of Jesus. They were challenged to reduce his divinity. And if you like, just line him up alongside the other gods of the culture, the other gods of the age. That Jesus just becomes one more god in the pantheon of gods. You see, every village, every town, every city would have a list of gods that they would worship in their temples. And the temptation, the challenge, the pressure for the church was to reduce Jesus and just line him up alongside all the other gods. And Paul is writing to say, no, that is not what you're to do, because Jesus has the supremacy. Jesus is absolutely supreme. You see, the gods that were in the temple in Colossae, they may have been carved of wood, they may have been carved of stone and that type of thing. They may have had funny names. But actually, in essence, they were the same gods that we, meaning our culture, worships today. They just had different names. They just looked different. And the temptation for the church was to reduce Jesus and just line him up as one other God. And Paul says, no, Jesus is supreme. The other pressure that they faced was to think it's Jesus plus something that we need. Jesus plus something else. There was always a temptation for the early church to merge again with Judaism. The church had come from Judaism, if you like, but there was always this temptation to go back to it. Judaism at the time was primarily a religion of works, We're always tempted to go back to a religion that's based upon works, that's based upon performance. Because if we can say to ourselves, but I'm a good person, we feel that's going to stand us in good stead. But in some way that's going to justify us before God. And there was this temptation to kind of come under again the Jewish law, to make new converts become Jews as well as becoming Christians. We like to justify ourselves through our works by saying, but I'm a good person. And of course that is not the gospel. The other pressure was Jesus plus what was called Gnosticism. It basically meant that it was a Jesus plus special revelation, special knowledge, some sort of special code, some sort of special practice, something that only a few people could take hold of, something that only a few people knew about. And you need Jesus, but you also need the extra revelation, the extra knowledge, the extra practice. And Paul writes them and says, no. Jesus is supreme. And Jesus is sufficient. Jesus is supreme, and Jesus is sufficient. Let's take a look at what he says. Verse 15. The Son, he says, the Son is the image of the invisible God. The Son is the image of the invisible God. Just think about that for a moment. My brother lives in Belfast. He came to visit us on Thursday with his family. They were over for the week. And I guess if you were to put me and my brother next to each other, you might look at us and you might go, oh yeah, I can see like a sort of family likeness. I can see a sort of family resemblance. But I guess it's not that much of a likeness, but it's a bit of a likeness. And it makes you wonder, what sort of likeness is Jesus to God? The Son is the image of the invisible God. What sort of image? What sort of likeness? Well, the word that Paul uses for image is the Greek word icon. It's where we get our English word icon from, just in case that was news to you. And the word icon means an exact likeness, an exact representation. So when Paul says that Jesus is the image, the icon of the invisible God, what he's saying is that Jesus is the exact likeness of God. He's the exact representation of God. If you've seen Jesus, you've seen the Father. That's what Jesus says. How is that the case? Well, in John chapter 1, another incredibly important passage about the person of Jesus, you'll know it because we always read it at Christmas. It begins by saying this. It says, in the beginning was the Word. The Word there refers to the person of Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, and then it says, and the Word was with God, and then it says, and the Word was God. And then a little bit later it goes on to say, and the Word became flesh. Jesus is the exact representation of God because he is God. Bill Johnson, an American pastor, sometimes uses the phrase that Jesus is perfect theology. Why is that? Well, because theology is about the knowledge of God. And if you want to know what God is like, the place you have to look to is Jesus, because he is the perfect representation of God. Anything you believe about God that you do not see revealed in the person of Jesus, you have a right to question. Because Jesus is the image of the invisible God. If you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. The second thing Paul says, he says that Jesus is the firstborn over all creation. That sounds like a contradiction to what he's just said, doesn't it? Because if he's God, then how can he be born? You know, God doesn't have a beginning or an end, so how can he be God and be born? How can he be the firstborn? And actually there's a man called Arius in the 4th century who built a whole theology around this. He was one of the great heretics of the early church, and his whole theology was kind of rooted in this basic idea from this passage here in Colossians. But you see, when Paul talks about being the firstborn, he's not talking about the chronology of birth. He's not sort of grouping Jesus in with all the other things of creation. When he talks about the firstborn, he's talking about the status of Jesus. He's talking about the primacy of Jesus over everything. In Psalm 89, David is described as being the firstborn. But he wasn't the firstborn, he was the seventh born. But the psalmist says he was the firstborn. It's because David had the primacy. He was supreme amongst Israel's kings. And Paul here says that Jesus is the firstborn over all creation. He has the supremacy over the whole of creation. Why? Verse 16. For in him all things were created. He goes on to say, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through Jesus and for Jesus. That's what Paul says. All things have been created through him and for him. In other words, Paul is simply saying that Jesus is the creator of everything. He is the agent of creation. He doesn't just say that he was the agent of creation, he's saying that the whole of creation was created for him. Two of the great existential questions that people ask are, who am I and why am I here? The answer to those questions, in essence, are found in that phrase. You're here, who you are someone that Jesus created. You are someone that Jesus wanted to be here. Your life is not an accident. You are someone that Jesus made. You are someone that reflects the image of God because Jesus created you. And of course, as we read the story of the gospel, we discover that that's true for everybody. But as we put our trust into Jesus, we become the adopted children of God. And then it says that we were created for Jesus. Why am I here? I'm here to bring glory to Jesus. Why do I exist? I exist simply for him, for his glory. Now, how you bring Jesus glory, that in some ways is kind of up to you. You might do that through being a professional footballer, or you might do that through being a school teacher, you might do that through being a mum or a friend or a cousin or whatever. But you're here to bring glory to Jesus. All things were created by him, and all things were created for him. Again goes on to say that he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He doesn't just create, but he sustains everything as well. I've heard people talk about the idea that if Jesus was to cease doing what Jesus does, then the whole universe would just disintegrate at the molecular level. Because the Bible says that it's Jesus that sustains it. It's Jesus that holds the whole thing together. He creates it and he sustains it. Then he goes on to say, and he is the head of the body, the church. He's the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead. What does that mean? What does it mean to be the firstborn among the dead? If you think about it, there were people that were raised from the dead before Jesus. Elijah raised people back to life from the dead. Jesus himself raised people to life before he himself was raised to life. So what does it mean by being the firstborn from among the dead? Well, everybody who was raised to life before Jesus, and actually people who are raised back to life today, because I believe that still happens, all of those people will still die again. Lazarus, Jesus' friend, who he raises from the dead just before Jesus' own death, Lazarus died again. But Jesus is unique. It's that word firstborn again. It's something about his status, his position. Jesus is unique because when Jesus was raised back to life by the Father, Jesus never died again. Jesus is eternal. And there's a sense in which Jesus he's like the pioneer for each one of us of resurrection life. He's the firstborn from the dead. We will follow in his footsteps, but he is the firstborn from among the dead. Then he goes on and says this, after that phrase, it just says this, so that, and this is Paul's point, in everything, Jesus might have the supremacy. So that in everything, Jesus has the supremacy. And then Paul goes on to talk about his sufficiency. Verse 19. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. And then it says, and through Jesus to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through Jesus to reconcile to Jesus all things, through his blood shed on the cross. A little bit later, verse 22, it says, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you, listen to this, to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. The sufficiency of Jesus. I am one of the it's always an honour, actually, to take at someone's funeral. And whoever they are, but even if you didn't really know them, it's an honour. But one of the sad things about taking funerals, and I know that I took a funeral for Vera on Friday, and this is not in any way linked to that at all, but one of the sad things generally about when you take funerals is you discover how many families are unreconciled. In so many families there are people who are not reconciled to somebody else, and it's just such a sad thing. The idea of reconciliation means to live in harmony, and so often when you take a funeral you discover that people are not living in harmony with each other. And one of the things that you also find is that there's then sort of like degrees. I mean, there aren't actually degrees of reconciliation, but people satisfy themselves with some sort of degree of reconciliation. And it's that sort of reconciliation that's kind of like, well, I don't really like them, but for the sake of Mum, I'll tolerate you today. It's that sort of we'll be civil. And it's sad, but that is not the sort of reconciliation that Paul is speaking about here. That is not the sort of reconciliation that Jesus achieved for us on the cross. It's not like a half-hearted reconciliation. It is a full and a complete reconciliation. He says that he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in his sight, without blemish and free from accusation. It's a full and a complete reconciliation that Jesus achieved for us. We stand before God holy in his sight, without blemish and without accusation. We have been completely and utterly reconciled to God through Jesus. I'm mindful of time. let me just say one other thing quickly. Well, that's what Paul's wanting them to know. He wants them to know that Jesus is supreme and that Jesus is sufficient for every single one of them. There's no relegating Jesus to the level of everything else. He's supreme. There's no need to have Jesus plus something else, because Jesus is totally sufficient. And then he says this, he says, if you continue in your faith. If you continue in your faith. What does he mean by that? Well, I don't think Paul is speaking there about those doubts that we sometimes have during life. We sometimes think, oh, well, am I in the right place? What is God calling me to? I'm not really sure. Maybe we're living with some sort of unanswered prayer. We have doubts about that. I think Paul is speaking simply about faith in the supremacy and the sufficiency of Jesus Christ. That he has reconciled us to God through his blood. Sometimes people ask the question, can I lose my salvation? Have you ever thought that, or you hear people asking? What people often mean by that, I think, is can somebody sin enough to take them from a place of being saved to no longer saved? That's often what sort of lies behind the question, I think. And I guess my thought about that is this, that if you think you can sin so much that you would lose your salvation, you've never really fully understood the idea that salvation is simply through faith and not through works. If you think that salvation can be earned through works or lost through works, you've never really understood the idea that actually salvation is the free gift of God according to his grace because of your faith. Works are important because works affect the reward. But works don't affect salvation, because salvation comes through faith in the sufficiency of Jesus. Because when he shed his blood and when he said it's finished, it was enough. It was enough for everybody who places their faith in him. Jesus is supreme, and Jesus is sufficient. Last week Josh talked about the temptation to find ourselves within ourselves. It's the great narrative of Disney and so much of our culture. Be true to yourself. Just find out who you are. Go with that. The good news of the gospel is you don't need to find yourself in yourself. You can find yourself in the person of Jesus, who is supreme and who is sufficient in every single way, for every single person. And that is the good news of the gospel, that my faith, my trust is not in me, it's not in my goodness, it's in the sufficiency and the supremacy of the Son of God, who shed his blood for me. And that is the good news. It's the best news there is. Let's pray.